This document is a memorandum to all CIA station chiefs on how to combat Warren Commission critics. In other words, how to defend the Warren Commission. Okay, reading again from paragraph 4A of 1035-60, April 1st, 67. No significant new evidence has emerged which the Commission did not consider. The assassination is sometimes compared, e.g. by Joachim Yosten and Bertrand Russell, with the Dreyfus case. However, unlike that case, the attacks on the Warren Commission have produced no new evidence, no new culprits have been convincingly identified, and there is no agreement among the critics. A better parallel, though an imperfect one, might be with the Reichstag fire of 1933, which some competent historians, Fritz Tobias, A.J.P. Taylor, and D.C. Watt, now believe was set by von der Lubbe on his own initiative without acting for either Nazis or communists. The Nazis tried to pin the blame on the communists, but the latter have been much more successful in convincing the world that the Nazis were to blame. Okay, now, what this basically is talking about here, of course, is the Reichstag fire in which the Nazis, not Martinus von der Lubbe, last name, by the way, V-A-N-D-E-R-L-U-B-B-E, in which the Nazis burned down the German parliament, the Reichstag building, blamed it on the communists, and used that as an excuse to impose dictatorial laws suspending traditional German liberties. And this, of course, was the mechanical device by which the Nazis assumed their total control over German society. Now, the Reichstag fire, I've never heard, I'm not familiar with the work of Messrs. Tobias, Taylor, and Watt. I've read a fair amount about World War II, and I've never heard anyone suggest that the Reichstag fire was anything but the Nazi provocation that it is attributed, that it has generally been labeled. The Reichstag fire was supposedly, according to the Nazis, set by Martinus von der Lubbe, who was legally blind and legally insane, and according to John Gunther in his book Inside Europe 1937, was, quote, thrown out of the Dutch Communist Party for being the useless fellow that he was, unquote. And here we have to the Reichstag fire itself, Reichsmarshal Hermann Goering, head of the German Air Force, had a house right next door to the Reichstag. A tunnel adjoined that building, and he appeared on the Reichstag steps as the flames were licking up in earnest, and denounced the communists and so forth. And then there was a very famous trial in which the Nazis were eloquently and thoroughly put down, but it did not in any way affect the verdict that Martinus von der Lubbe, the legally blind and legally insane lone nut, set the fire. Now, the scary part about this memo is that basically we have here an endorsement of the Nazi view of history from an official American government document. In other words, here it's saying that basically von der Lubbe was a lone nut, but that the communists have been very successful in defaming the poor Nazis.
And not only do we have an American government intelligence official endorsing the Nazi view of history, but that they are using that Nazi view of history to in turn turn around and derogate the critics of the Warren Commission. So this is what we're seeing when we're talking about misinformation. We're not only talking about very subtle misinformation, we're literally talking about things like Nazi propaganda and Gestapo memos being used to derogate critics of the Warren Commission, and that goes a step beyond some of the other things that we've talked about.
Now, of course, Jack Ruby, maybe he doesn't look quite so silly now, saying the Nazis are in control of our government. Now, it may be a source of puzzlement to many people as to why we see these Nazi viewpoints, in essence, being disseminated by the CIA. Recall that a 1937 Gestapo memo was used by CIA to defame Joachim Yosten, Joe Yosten, and then a declassified CIA memorandum says, oh, no sweat, if you want to put down the Warren Commission critics, point out that it was the work of a lone nut, just like the Reichstag fire, although the commies have been very successful in defaming and pinning that on the Nazis. Now, basically, this endorsement of the Nazi viewpoint should not come on the part of the CIA, should not come as much of a shock as it may to some of you. There is a very, very important chapter in American history and in the history of the Cold War, which is virtually unknown in this country. And basically that centers around the role in American society and in the Cold War played by a man named Galen. His first name was Reinhard. His last name is spelled G-E-H-L-E-N. Now, Reinhard Galen was Hitler's most important intelligence officer during World War II. He was in charge of all intelligence for the Third Reich on the Eastern Front, and in that capacity was head of an organization called Fremde Heere Ost, which I've heard variously translated as Foreign Armies East. That's the most common translation, or occasionally Foreign Intelligence East. Now, this basically was, as I said, Hitler's Eastern Front Intelligence Organization during World War II supplied the Reich with all of its intelligence on Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, and it made very, very, very heavy use, and this is important for our purposes here, of the large anti-communist underground, which was basically left behind by the Tsarist elements after the Russian Revolution. There was still a lot of White Russians in Russia, and they were the Germans availed themselves of this White Russian underground to spy upon Russia. Now, the United States at the end of the war did not have an intelligence capability to speak of in Russia and Eastern Europe, so what they did was 3 months after the war ended in Europe, a series of negotiations between Galen and the Americans concluded with Galen being flown into the United States in the uniform of a 4-star general. Keep in mind, 3 months after the war ends in Europe, and basically Galen and his entire Eastern Front Intelligence Organization, Fremde Heere Ost, with more than 4,000 SS and Gestapo veterans included in it, that organization was grafted onto the fledgling CIA and became its Department of Russian and Eastern European Affairs. That organization, again, Hitler's Eastern Front Intelligence Organization with SS and Gestapo agents galore, provided the United States with all of its intelligence, exclusive purveyor of intelligence on Russia and Eastern Europe, for more than a decade after the end of World War II, and the CIA continued to rely upon it very heavily after that. There were 2 other very important incarnations about the Galen organization to keep in mind. One was that coterminous with its role as the CIA's Department of Russian and Eastern European Affairs, it became the official NATO intelligence organization, supplying NATO with up to 70% of its intelligence. And finally, it became the West German Intelligence Service, the BND, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, and it is basically that to this day. Now, keep in mind that this organization provided us with all of our information on Russia and Eastern Europe, and keep in mind the White Russians and the reactionary Eastern Europeans who form an important element of this. In particular, a group which is known under a couple of names as NTS, the Russian abbreviation initials for Death to Tyrants, also known as the Solidarists. Now, not solidarity, but solidarists. Okay, and Nipper's going to tell you about a very important member of the Solidarists.
Indeed. And before I do this, I want to just go back one more time and touch on this, because this is something that Dave and I have talked about a great deal on KFJC, but it's still a lot of things that most people do not fully take into account. What we are talking about is within 3 months after the cessation of hostilities in Europe in World War II, the CIA had begun to literally graft the entire Nazi Eastern Front intelligence operation, including, as Dave said, fully trained Gestapo and SS members, and Reinhard Galen himself, one of Hitler's right-hand men, one of the men high in the councils of Hitler. Several of these people were literally sprung from the docket and from the holding cells at Nuremberg as war criminals, and were immediately snatched up and spirited off. Klaus Barbie was only the most recent example of one of these people who cut his deal with the CIA. But this is an entire organization, thousands strong, that was just literally grafted on to the United States intelligence services. So we're talking about not only just the management, but literally the manpower. Maybe fully a quarter of our original manpower in the CIA were SS and Gestapo members. This is something you don't hear much about in your local civics classes.